Good afternoon. It's really great to be here at PDC. My name is Alexander Malik. I'm a lead on the SharePoint team, and I work on a couple different things, but it's all in the realm of workflow in SharePoint. So I work on the SharePoint platform, workflow platform that we shipped in 2007, and I also work on the tools that we shipped in SharePoint Designer, and working with the Visual Studio team also on the Visual Studio tools for workflow. So it's all workflow all the time. I'm excited to be showing you some tips and tricks for building SharePoint workflows that talk to external systems, with a kind of an asynchronous pattern. I'll show you how you can do that with humans and with systems, and also how you can plug into the new Azure services platform. And as part of that, there's a thing called .NET Services, which is really, there's a ton of cool stuff in there. But the thing in there that I'm going to show using is just publishing a web service as an endpoint kind of in the cloud so that you can actually traverse firewalls, have a system in company A talk to a system in company B. It's some pretty cool stuff. Anyway, let's jump in. So I'm going to start by just doing a quick overview, about 10 minutes, kind of SharePoint workflow and how you do asynchronous messaging in SharePoint workflow. Because everyone has different expectations when they come to a session, I like to set it up so that the first 15 minutes are all kind of just an overview, so that if you're just interested in understanding kind of the core idea and want to go play with it on your own, pretty much a 15-minute point, you'll kind of know the core ideas that I'm going to be presenting. And the next 45 minutes after that is just coding. So if you just want an overview, I won't be hurt if after 15 minutes you head out. But after that, I'll spend the next 45 minutes strictly in Visual Studio, building a pretty cool scenario of a SharePoint workflow talking to an external system. Okay, so let's quickly talk about SharePoint workflow and how it plugs into the Microsoft workflow ecosystem. We have a lot of products at Microsoft kind of in the workflow space. I highlighted the three I thought were most interesting for this presentation. So SharePoint, we think, is a great platform for human workflows, particularly document workflows. So if you have IW content, IW storing documents, and you want a place to run human workflows, it's sort of a natural place to write that kind of application, because it's easier to kind of bring that to your documents rather than trying to get all the messaging out to some external system. So we think that's really where the sweet spot is for SharePoint workflow. But we have other offerings that are targeted at other kinds of apps. So this week we actually announced a new addition to the Windows application role in Windows Server that we're calling Dublin Server. And that's kind of a more pure process server if you want to build custom business apps. And the way, I don't show Dublin in my demo, but the idea would be that if you had a business application, and it really was kind of processing some kind of internal data, you could build that in Dublin, and there's some great new tools you should check out there. We also have BizTalk Server, which we think is a top-tier platform for doing data orchestration, so kind of EAI type applications. And really, I mean, the point of this presentation and kind of what we're trying to do is make it easy to have these platforms talk to each other. We're going to continue over time, look at how we can make the platforms make sense and where they can be aligned. But I think the key is really we got to make it easy for them to talk to each other. And, in this session, I show how you use WCF to talk to, essentially like SharePoint to like a Dublin server. And WCF is the glue between all our application servers. Just going for one more second into SharePoint workflow, one of the other nice things about building your workflows into SharePoint is just you have all this other collaboration framework to go leverage. So if you're trying to do an application and you want a little bit of business logic there, a collaboration application, and you want a bit of business logic there, it's easy to kind of just add your workflow right to your SharePoint site. Okay, so really the sweet spot for SharePoint workflow is human workflow scenarios, approval scenarios, really review, that kind of essentially assigning a task to someone and waiting for them to do something. That's really where we have invested and will continue to invest in terms of workflow scenarios. You may not think of it, but a task essentially, a task in a SharePoint workflow is essentially an activity that's talking to an external system. The external system being the SharePoint task store. So it's interesting when you look at the way tasks work, it actually is a great foundation for not only talking to tasks, but also for talking to external systems. Essentially, the way it works is the workflow, we've added all this infrastructure so that when you use a task activity in a SharePoint workflow, we have all this plumbing that knows how to correlate messages between your SharePoint workflow and essentially event fire in SharePoint. So if that task changes, we do all the plumbing to get that event back into the workflow. And so this is really what we're good at. And it turns out that in the SharePoint 2007 timeframe, that really is the best way to talk to external systems as well. You know, there are other, post.NET 3, which SharePoint 2007 is based on, there were other enhancements made to workflow. There's some great integration of WCF into WF. But we don't support that. That came out after SharePoint 2007 shipped. So you can actually use the send-receive activities. In this demo, I will show you, though, how you can call a WCF endpoint and add a WCF service to SharePoint. So I'll show you how you can use WCF even though we don't have native support for the new activities. We do have, there was an older extensibility model for those familiar with WF that was part of .NET 3.0. It was called EDES, External Data Exchange Services. And we looked at making that extensible, but because of the sort of the tidal wave around WCF, it seemed like to make more sense to wait and add that support in the subsequent release. So really the way that it's super straightforward. So there really isn't any rocket science in this demo. The way to talk to an external system is to use what we call the business task pattern. Essentially, you create a task that's not assigned to any human, and you use the innate support in SharePoint for correlating events from that item into the workflow as sort of your proxy for anything you want to do externally. So the way you do the pattern, essentially, is you create a business task in a task list, and then you call that external system. If it's an ASMX, that's cool, or you can use WCF, which I'll do in this demo. And then, essentially, you wait for that item to change. So you're not going to get, the workflow is not directly going to get called back. You've got to have this proxy in the middle. It's straightforward, and that's really what we do recommend you do. And you can directly, depending where that system's located, I guess, if it's on the same machine, you can directly, very easily talk to the SharePoint object model. If it's on another machine, you can use the SharePoint web services. In this demo, I'll actually show you at the end where you can actually create a web service in SharePoint so that that machine could be actually behind another company's firewall. So using WCF in SharePoint, I thought it'd be good to talk 2 seconds about this. So it is possible to actually create a WCF service inside of SharePoint. This is sort of for that latter part, like for the external system calling back into SharePoint, if you want to do that via WCF. You can do it inside the SharePoint application if you want. There's actually a great post on how to do this by a gentleman, Michael Washam. And you can actually find that also off of Paul Andrews' blog, who's one of the technical marketing folk for SharePoint. However, actually, SharePoint recommends generally that it's simpler to actually put it in a separate web application. You don't have to then use the ASP.NET backwards compatibility mode. And it's just a little bit cleaner in terms of you don't have to throw a ton of stuff into your SharePoint web.config. So I thought it'd be good just to throw that out, that it is possible, it works. But if you create the WCF service in another application on the same box, it's a little bit cleaner. The only downside you get of doing this is that you don't get that. In SharePoint, you always have this context web whenever something gets spun up inside the application, like an event. And you won't get that kind of natively if you build your service outside of the SharePoint app. And you can go get that web if you know the location kind of for where the service is sort of attached to. But that's one downside. And then at the very end, I'm going to show you using the Azure Services Platform. And really, the key piece I'm using there is this thing that I already mentioned called the Service Bus. It's part of the .NET Services subsystem. It's worth taking a look at all the stuff in there. It's a huge new set of services offerings. Just the .NET Services piece is interesting, but then there's all kinds of other goodies in there, too. And the Service Bus, the thing I'm going to show is registering our service essentially in the cloud so that any other company could talk to that service. And it looks like it's running in the cloud, but they'll do the relay so that it goes into your local application sitting behind your firewall. There's also some other cool stuff in there, kind of enterprise service bus type functionalities. but sort of internet service bus. So the idea there is you can actually publish messages kind of in a multicast fashion. So let's say you have some very loosely coupled apps, and you're like, hey, you might care about this information, but I don't really care what you do with it. So you can publish these messages to the internet service bus, and those apps can just subscribe to, hey, if that happens. So like, for example, a new customer gets added in my, my customer application. I can have applications subscribe to that actually aren't tied directly into that app. So there's a lot of stuff in the services bus offering. So that's kind of a really quick overview of the things I'm going to show. I'm going to show you building a SharePoint workflow that uses a human task, that then uses a business task to talk to an external system, and last, that has those two systems be behind separate firewalls. That's kind of, in a nutshell, the things I'll be showing. And the way you do that is, like I said, with this business task pattern. Really, from now on, it's just going to be coding. So let's dive into that. Just going to set up here for 1 second. So the scenario I'll be showing is kind of this onboarding application. Really, I just need an excuse for having an approval that talks to a business system in the back to get some kind of sign-off. So the idea is I assign a task to a human, I wait for it to be approved, and then once it's approved, I actually then essentially call into an external system and say, hey, I've gotten this approval, am I good to notify the initiator that this employee has been onboarded? So you can see I'm going to assign a task, wait for it to be approved, call the external system, and then wait for that system to call me back. So it'll be completely asynchronous. It's not going to be I'm going to call and immediately get a response. I'm going to call and say, call me back when you're done. Here's kind of a walkthrough of the actual workflow. So you send the task, and you can have this kind of iteration. That's actually really easy in SharePoint if you use tasks. That kind of change request and delegation just comes for free. It's one of the nice things about using tasks in SharePoint. Then I call the system, wait for it to be updated, and then mark it approved. In terms of what I'm working on here, I actually have a single machine with 3 separate apps. I'm using SharePoint for the approval workflow. I'm going to sort of create this service just quickly so that I have something to talk to. And then I'm going to actually build another service on the SharePoint side so that service can call back into SharePoint. That'll be the last part of the demo when I want those two machines to essentially be behind separate firewalls. All right, I think I can skip that. All right, first part. Let's quickly walk through what it means to do sort of asynchronous communication with a human inside of SharePoint. And if anyone has any questions, if you could wait till the end, I'll be around for a bit and happy to answer any questions you have. So in Visual Studio 2008, we added some new project templates right into the Pro SKU that make it really easy to build workflows for SharePoint. You can find them underneath the Office 2007 node. You can see here SharePoint sequential workflow or SharePoint state machine workflow. And if I create those, I'll get a blank workflow with kind of the right glue for it to work in SharePoint. There's a couple special things you need to do in SharePoint in terms of how they need to be activated so that we can pass in the right context, that web context that I mentioned. I've actually already done a bit of bootstrapping here. It's essentially a blank workflow. The only thing I've done is I've already set up an initiation form. So I've gone and designed an initiation form just so that, actually I got the wrong title on here, onboarding. I've already gone and created this form, and then what you need to do is you created an info path, you publish it out, and then you go generate this class that goes and will deserialize the stuff out of that form. Since the demo isn't about forms in SharePoint, I didn't want to spend time on that. There's a great blog post on the SharePoint team blog. It's actually like there's an 8-part series on how to build SharePoint workflows, and it will go into this. It's pretty straightforward. Essentially, you generate the form, you use this tool to generate this deserialization class, and then the tip I'll give you is just you need to make sure to edit these. SharePoint apps have a packaging format called the solution framework, and you need to edit these XML files. So if you ever have problems with forms, believe me, you will. If you do work with SharePoint workflow, the form stuff is a bit tricky. Make sure you got the URLs for these ASPXs that host the InfoPath form. You need to have the URNs to the forms. And then the last thing, and this has bitten me a couple times, you need to make sure to deploy those forms. So the feature XML sort of says what are all the elements I'm going to deploy. That workflow is an element, but the forms themselves are elements that you need to deploy. And the way you do that is what's called a manifest. So you can see in the element manifest, these are just the files to deploy. If you don't do this part, InfoPath gets really grumpy. So that's a little tip. All right, so really all I've done is say, hook up that form so that when the workflow is initiated, the user gets presented with this form, and then we move on. And I've actually, if I show you the code, then I added a little bit of code just to essentially take, when the workflow is activated, go deserialize that information and store it in these variables. So assignee instructions and comments. All right. So if you want to learn more about that, I'll show you a link at the end. It's easy to find, too. And it's fairly straightforward as long as you kind of follow those couple tips. All right. So creating a human task is straightforward. All you really need to do is use the activities that we shipped in SharePoint 2007. They'll automatically show up if you install Visual Studio 2008 on your SharePoint box. That's one of the requirements for developing for SharePoint, is that you do need to have the development tools on the same box as SharePoint. So we have a thing called create task, and to create a task, you just drop that in. Now, I'll walk you through kind of the things that are required to work with that. I talked about we've done all this infrastructure for essentially correlating messages inside the SharePoint system with back into the workflow. And the way we do that correlation is with what we call a token. And that's really, that's the trick to getting tasks to work. You just have to know kind of the two things you need to do so that SharePoint has a unique way to identify the workflow activity with the task item that's in the SharePoint list. So the way you do this is just to create a token, and you just give it a name. And I'm going to call it user task token. And then just need to set what its parent activity is, and I'll just make the workflow the parent activity. And we can't correlate with just one piece of information. We actually need two things. So I need this ID, which is a GUID. I need a unique GUID, and I don't have a GUID, so I'm going to actually go create one. So let me go to the code. So here in the head of the class, I'm going to define some variables for my task. So I'm going to create a GUID. I got some notes here. So I just need to create a GUID, and I'll, in the actual, when the task activity itself is activated, I'll give that GUID a unique value. Now, there's one other variable you have to pass in, and that's what we call a task property bag. And that's just essentially the default values for the task. So we pass it into the activity, and it goes and pumps it into the item when it's created. And so there's actually a class you need to use for that. It's called the SP workflow task. Workflow task properties. So I'll call that user task props. And really, that's all you need to do to that's all you need to pass in to that activity. So let me go back to the design view, and I will set that task ID, and I'll pass in that property bag, which currently has no value. I could also pass in just an int into this list item ID property, and that would actually then return me what's the ID of the item that was created subsequently. So if you later on want that ID for something, you can also use the correlation variables to go find the item too, and that's the way we're going to do it. So I need to actually set those things. So let me go to the invoking method. The default one, just say user task ID equals, just need to give it a random GUID. Okay, and now I actually want to pass in some default values to that task. So I'm going to set that property bag. The way it works is that if there are fields that are intrinsic to the task list, you can just reference those using the dot notation. So the title, for example. So I can say, please approve this new employee. Similarly, I can set the assign to field. And I mentioned that in the initiation form, I actually bring in a new user that I stored in this assignee variable. And I'll use that. Similarly, I have there's a description field, and I'll pass in some instructions that I got from the initiation form. For any fields that you've added custom to the form, you actually have to use this property bag that we call extended properties. So I added a comments field in the form, and that's actually not a native field in SharePoint, so I need to refer to it using the extended properties notation and just give the name of the field, which was comments. OK, so now I've actually created the task. Now, the thing is, it actually will not wait for the task to come back. It just creates the task and it goes on. So we need to define the logic to actually wait for the task to be changed, and then we can define what does completion mean. And what I actually did was in my task form, which I can bring up, I have a checkbox called is finished, and that's essentially the way that we'll determine that the task is completed. So I'm finished reviewing. So let's see, let me go back. So I'm going to, the way you do this essentially is you add a while activity, and you just say, I'm going to keep looping and essentially receiving events for when the task is changed. So this is another activity that we ship that just essentially gets events every time the task is changed. And I'm going to use that correlation token that I defined earlier, and that's the way it knows which task we're talking about. And I pass it actually the two pieces of data, the correlation token and the ID. Now, the thing with, because I actually want to see, hey, is the task finished, I need to get the results, essentially, the current value of the task. And we have two more task property bags where you can look at sort of before the task was updated and after the task was updated, so that you can do like, if it was changed from this to this. So the way that you can see here are the properties, after properties and before properties. And so I just need to define two new SP workflow task property variables. Just going to copy that and just say, the interesting thing about the initial one, the props, it just gets passed in. It doesn't represent the task. So if you go query it or try to update it, it won't actually do anything. It's just used to kind of pass values in. Really, all the property bags are just sort of, they're either passing in or receiving. So they're not stateful. So I created these two new property bags, and I'm just going to set them here. So after. So there's a little bit of they're simple hoops to jump through, and really it's just about walking through what they are, and then it becomes second nature. So the last thing I need to do, so I've set the correlation token so it knows which task I'm talking about. I've passed in the property bag so that I can actually find out what value's been changed to. And then all I need to do is actually say, I need to sort of have some way of measuring task completion. So I'm just going to create a bool. Sort of say, is user task finished? It's false. And then essentially set that based on the value that comes out of that after property bag. So I'm going to do, actually I need to parse this into a bool. Then I say user task after props. It's in the extended property bag because it's not a native field, but it was called is finished. So really all we're doing here is saying, if that box was checked, let's get that and store that in a bool. And then in the condition, in the while loop, we'll actually check that. So here, what I do now is I set a condition. You can do conditions either using rules or using code. I'll use code, and I'll just say, check user task. And I'll say, essentially, it just wants a result every time it calls this, and that's in this arguments. There's a result variable you need to set to essentially false to stop looping. So essentially, if the checkbox is true, I want the loop to stop. So I need to say is user. So just need to not it, and that should be it. Oops. Let's see if it built. Oh. Yep, always remember you got to cast the string. Let's try that one. See quickly. Yeah, there we go. All right. So that essentially is enough to model the pattern of assigning something to a human, and then the workflow will dehydrate. That's something important to know about SharePoint. The workflow will stop executing memory. That's how we get tons of sort of parallelism of workflows that can run. And then when that task item is updated, it'll boot up the workflow host again and pass it the message. So that's enough essentially to do the asynchronous pattern with a human. The only thing is if you want the task to essentially appear complete, you need to put one more activity in, which is really just the complete task activity. So this just updates the item in the task list. So it's as simple as giving it those same two correlation IDs and then just setting an outcome. So we'll say complete. All right, so let's quickly see if this will run. So what happens now is Visual Studio creates a solution package. It's actually a cab file that has a WSP extension. It deploys it into SharePoint, and then it activates it. There's some cool stuff in Visual Studio where it'll automatically actually attach the workflow to a document library. I already went and did that beforehand. It's right in the wizard, sort of when you create a new solution. So it'll automatically attach it to this employees list that I have. So here it's attached to the new. It's taking me directly to the new employee registration document library. I have an employee here I want to test it on. So I go to the workflows context menu, and I run, here's my PDC approval workflow. And so here I have that initiation form, so I'll assign it to me. We'll say, test, and submit it. So now what it should do is it should take those values and pass it into that property bag, which it passes into that task activity, which will create the task item. So you can see here the approval's in progress. I click that. It takes you to the summary page for the workflow, and you can see there is one task assigned to me. I get that. That'll actually bring up my task form. And now if I click that, that should now trigger my while loop and mark it complete. So pretty simple. And that's the way you do messaging from a SharePoint workflow to anything. In this case, it's a human. Now we're going to go do it to an external system using the exact same pattern. So I first need something to call, so I'm quickly going to switch gears and go create a WCF service. And so really, the idea here is this is supposed to be a service on some external system that'll go do, it'll, for example, have them go provision an office for this employee, for example, and who knows how long that'll take. So I want to call in and say, hey, when you're ready here, let's call me back. And so, often you'll have some external system that won't have a service, so you'll often have to create some kind of proxy service. And there's some pretty cool tools in WCF, and with the new Dublin services that are part of Windows Application Server, you actually have a very scalable host for business workflows and business services. One of the cool things about WCF is that you can actually model a service with a workflow. I found that a little bit kind of difficult to comprehend at first. It's sort of a strange notion because a workflow to me is sort of sequential. But I'll show you in a second. You can actually model some pretty cool things if you use a workflow. So I'll just call this, external system proxy. And by using a workflow to model a service, what you essentially do is, so by default, you get a get data, which is essentially an endpoint for external systems to call into. You can also use send data. And the nice thing about using a workflow to model a service is that you can define ordering of operations, which you can't do very easily kind of just writing it by hand. So, for example, if you need step 1 to happen before step 2, and they're totally decoupled, by modeling as a workflow, by having a get data and then another get data, essentially the workflow will ensure that the second get data doesn't get called before the first one. So it allows you to do ordering of operation calls. That's one of the coolest things of using a workflow to model a service. I'm not going to use that in this demo. I'm really just going to kind of create a dummy service. So really I need a service that has a pointer back to that business task that I'm going to go create. So I mentioned that the pattern is create a task, pass the ID essentially to the external system, and then the external system will go update that item when it's done. So I'm going to go actually to the contract for this. So working with WCF is fairly straightforward. You have a contract that defines kind of the message, and then you have operations within that. Those are sort of the functions that you get to call. So I want the workflow to call into this and say update external system. And I want to pass 3 arguments. I want to pass essentially to identify an item, and I know it's in a task list. I need the item ID, I need the site URL, and I need the web name. So we'll just say I need an int, that's the list item ID. I need a string, that's the site URL. And I need a string, that's the web name. This is an illustrative scenario. You wouldn't probably do it quite this simplistically, but I think it'll give you an idea for how you can have your workflow talk to your external system. So I've now updated my contract. I'll go here. I need to actually have it use. You just need to make sure that the activity is bound to that same contract. And now what I need to do is the activity itself has those 3 properties, site name, URL, and I need to actually define getters and setters so that it can take that message when the operation is called, and then bind it to variables that are in the local workflow. So all that means is I need to define 3 variables to represent those 3 things I defined. So I need a list item ID. I need I set a site URL and a web name. So I've defined my 3 things, and now I just need to define the properties. So this will be list item ID. I also have a return value. I'll just actually hard code the return value to be message received. Most likely, you would do some confirmation validation and then, pass back an ID. In this case, we don't really need that much complication. All right, so I need to define properties for site URL. It's using the right casing. So this is just a bit of tax in terms of getting all the properties bound into the activity. Okay, so I've defined a string for the site URL, a string for the web name, and an int for the ID. Define properties for all 3, and then I come in here and just bind those. Actually, I'll bind the return value as well. So really, as simple as that now, I've created an endpoint, a service with one endpoint that's called update. If you recall here, it was called update external system, and it'll take 3 variables, and then it'll store those so that I can do something with them. Now, the interesting thing that isn't immediately obvious, if I drag something below in this workflow, let's say a delay, that is not going to that's not synchronously going to happen with a call. That actually, the message will be returned, the message received, and from the caller's standpoint, this thing is no longer running. But like I said, by using a workflow, you can actually define ordering. So I'm actually going to have it delay and then just call back. We'll do it like 10 seconds. And then to call back, because SharePoint doesn't have native WCF services for you to work with, we're going to just use a code activity. And actually, to start, we're just going to, because this is running on the local SharePoint box, I'm just going to directly use a SharePoint OM. We'll change that later to go use that new service. Like I said, we're going to create two services, one on the external system and then one on the local SharePoint system. The local SharePoint one's just essentially going to be the one that goes and talks to the object model, because that's not remotable, except if you're crazy and want to use the web services. So yeah, it's a good pattern to go with, creating a service on your SharePoint side, and that way you can use WCF kind of on both ends. So this will be, so after 10 seconds, this program kind of on the back-end side is going to call back. So call SharePoint. And really, I'm going to do some pretty straightforward stuff here with, if you're familiar with SharePoint, working with the SharePoint object model, I'm just going to go grab the site and the web, and then the list, and then that specific list item. I've gotten the 3 values to go identify those, and then I'm just going to go update it. So I just added a reference to Windows SharePoint Services. So I need some way to message back. I would probably, go to the effort of creating a content type to represent this business task, and I would, create some special field. But in this case, for brevity, I'm just going to actually use the title field and set it to true when the task is complete. All right, so SP. So I'm going to use here the site URL property that I defined. That got passed into me. Now I'm going to get the web. By using the web name property. Now I'm going to get the list. In this case, I know what list I want. It's just going to be the tasks list. Again, this is just for expediency. So I give the name of the tasks list, and then I'm going to actually go fetch the item. And that's using the SP list item class. And so there's a get item by ID, and I'm actually going to pass in that list item ID that I received. So really, with those 4 lines of code, I took the 3 properties that I was given, and I was able to actually go hunt down the item. So this is the backend system talking to SharePoint. Again, like I said, I am cheating in assuming that it's on the local box, and we'll fix that a bit later. And then I'm just going to update the title. Oops. And like I said, I'll just use like a string like true, just to keep it really straightforward. All right, and then I need to update. I'm going to be lazy and not do the right thing and dispose these correctly. But the idea is just I need something to bootstrap my 2 systems talking to each other. All right, let me build that, see if that worked. Great. All right, so that's pretty much all I need to do to create a simple web service. Now I'm going to go back to my workflow, and I'm going to call that service. Now the first thing I need to do, though, is create that business task that I mentioned. And that's the thing that it'll go update when it's done. So essentially, I'm going to just quickly blow through and create the exact same pattern that I did here. To give it a little bit of, I'm just going to wrap that in a sequence, just so it's clearly separated from the stuff above it. But let's see. Drag in a create task. Drag in a while. Drag in a complete task and on task changed. Now the only difference this time is I also need a code task, and that'll be the thing that calls that endpoint. Oh, actually, let's boot that to make sure that service worked. So what you would normally do, again, if you were to build the enterprise class version of this, you would host that service in IIS and have it activated, probably automatically. In this case, I'm just going to use the default host. You can see here's my service, and it has those three, the operation has those three parameters. All right, so I've created now that same pattern. We'll give it a name just so we see it here easily. Call biz system. All right, so now I just need to go through those same hoops of creating the correlation token. So let me go to the code. So I had those user task variables. I'm going to just do the exact same thing for business task. I'd said that if I pass in an int, I can actually get the item ID, and I need that. I need to pass that to the external system. So I'll also define quickly an int for that. Biz task list item ID. All right, so now I have the stuff to pass into the create task. We'll create a token, biz task. Actually, I skipped a step. I actually had a summary for. Let me. So we defined in part one. We defined the workflow. In part two, we defined the endpoint, and now we're going to define the business task. Sorry, I jumped over that. All right, so again, use the two variables to actually do the correlation, so the ID and the correlation token. I'm going to pass in that ID variable I created. Oh, actually, sorry. Make sure to put public on that. Okay, just going to do those exact same things I did last time. Set the task property bag. Okay, then I'm going to come to this one, the change, and I'm going to give it the same correlation token that is created. I'm going to pass in, again, the after and before so that we can look at whether it's complete. In this case, we're just going to use the title field, like I said. Okay, set the complete task. So it's a little bit kind of rote. You just got to go through it, and we're looking at how we can make that more efficient. There's actually an activity called, I think, WSS task that you can use that kind of does this automatically, and there's some web postings on that. The only problem with that is that you can't really then get into the nitty-gritty of what does approval mean to me, like what properties do I want to look at to define, is it every task, is it just 50%? So by doing it this way, it's a little bit more work, but you get to define all the pieces yourself. All right, so I still need to go in actually and so like I did last time, when the actual task is initiated, I need to actually take that GUID, the biz task ID, and actually give it a random GUID, and I need to pass into that create task property bag what I want the task to be called. So that was biz task props, and we'll just set the title to something like system task. Now, normally you'd create like a user, like some kind of system user that you assign these tasks to, but I didn't create that, so I'll just actually use me temporarily. But you'd want to create some kind of system account so you could filter those tasks out of the views that users see, and they don't get the mails then also. All right, so I've finished the create task. Now let me go finish the, like I did before, I need to define a Boolean. Is business task finished? And that's defined essentially by that the title field in this case. Last time it was is finished property that I had added. So it was biz task after props title. Oops. And I want to remember to cast it to a string. So all that'll do now is go grab the title. The title, I'm going to set it to true from that external service, just as a way of saying, hey, we're done. And then I'm going to convert that to a bool. Then I can go define this condition to look at that. And we're just going to do that same pass back, essentially the not of whatever that is. All right, so now we want to get into the interesting part, which is calling that WCF service. So the way you do that is to add a service reference. So you go to References and add Service Reference. And I would have hosted in some way. In this case, I'm just using the default test client host. And that gives you a URL to the endpoint. So I'm going to use that. And I paste that in. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a proxy class for me to work with that service so that I don't have to, like in the old days with ASMXs, kind of manually new up a proxy. They'll actually go and create a proxy for you. So I'll call that external system proxy. So it went and found that service. And then using it is really quite easy. So I just need to actually add a reference to system.net. Oops. Okay, so now I just want to essentially new up that proxy in my code activity. So the way I do that is I use that external, it's called external system proxy. Oops, and then there's a client class as part of that, and that's just what you want to use, and I'll call that client. Now, the thing you need to pass into that is actually the name of the endpoint. And there's a little trick a little tip I can give you there. If you go into when I created that proxy class by adding a service reference, it went and created this app.config file. Now, the thing is, app.config means nothing to SharePoint, so that file is meaningless. But it does add, we're going to need to use this a couple times. So it does add this system.serviceModel section. And inside of that is a client section and actually has the name of the endpoints, and there's only one, so it's easy to find, and that's this. So the tip is to go look into the app.config, and then the client element, you can find this. There's actually an endpoint element. All right, so I'm just going to pass that in. All right, now I'm going to just set the credentials that we use. Since we're on the same machine, I can just use default network credentials. And again, we'll fix that later. It's a little bit tricky to actually find the credential property. It's client credentials, Windows client credential. Took a bit of time for me to hunt that down. And then I can just use the system.net credential cache. That was why I added the system.net reference. Okay, so that's really all you need to do to now create this proxy that can go talk to the service. Only 2 lines of code, and I can actually go talk to a WCF service. And then essentially, I can now say client.update external system, and I'll pass it that biz task list item ID I had. And I'll just hard code the name of the server. You would probably want to look this up. I want to make sure I got the name of the server right, AlexMod PDC test. And the name of the web is called docs, actually. So I'm calling that endpoint update external system with those 3 properties. And all I need to do at the end is actually close that client. Build it, see if that worked. Now, if you were in SharePoint, that would be all really you need to do, because the app.config would be the endpoint registration, because this is essentially calling. WCF is interesting. You have to define the endpoint locally that you're going to call, even though it's remote. So you got to define it locally and remote, sort of the, what's the contract. And so because app.config doesn't mean anything to SharePoint, what I need to do now is go to web.config. So in SharePoint, you got to go inet pub, and then www root wss. So in this case, it's just the default web app. I'm just going to edit web.config. And essentially, you'll see there is no system.service model node. So I can actually just copy that whole thing. This was generated for me by Visual Studio, but I just need to copy that into web.config. And really, now the endpoint is registered, so I can call it. So the two things I need to do, I guess, for it to work in SharePoint are you need to add that external system reference, and then you need to copy the stuff that's generating configuration into web.config, since SharePoint doesn't support app.config. And then last, you do need to reset the IIS. All right, so while that's resetting, let's quickly walk through what I did here. So just like with working with a human task, you create an item in the tasks list that represents, in this case, the business task. And then you call the service, you pass it, the cookie that says, here's where you call back, here's the item you want to update. And then you just look for it to change like you would with a human task. All right, let's see, is build. So now should be able to run that. Let me set a breakpoint in that external thing so that it can show that the service call works. So what it's going to do now, it's going to, just like before, we're going to assign the human task first. I just initiated the workflow there. It created the human task. And then I'm going to go complete that human task. Then it's going to go create a system task. Now, sometimes this will time out, but if the demo gods are with me. So it looks like it created the system task. And now what's going to happen is actually that other service, it gets called, waits 10 seconds, and then it'll call back, which is happening completely asynchronously. So I'll hit F5. And what it'll then go do is update that task item, which will boot my workflow up again, my SharePoint workflow. And that's a normal message. This isn't the error you're looking for. And then if I hit F5, you'll see the workflow completed, the task completed. So we're short on time, so I'm not going to kind of go through all the hoops of building that local service for that. So I have the external system, and I don't want to directly call the SharePoint object model. I won't be able to. I won't be on the local machine. So I'll walk you through quickly what it means to build another service and publish it into the service bus. It's actually extremely straightforward. You should play with it. You'll find it like it's as straightforward as just building a regular WCF service. So just like always, you define a contract. In this case, I want that external system to say update list, and it's going to pass me back the cookie that I gave it. And so I just create. So this is just like what I was doing before. This isn't a workflow defining a service. So in this case, I just have a normal. I just use code to go essentially do the same stuff that I was doing in that external service. So essentially, the SharePoint workflow is going to call the external service, which is going to call this local SharePoint service, but it's going to do it through the cloud. And so that really, nothing here was special to the .NET services. This is just regular WCF. The only difference is that you need to, in app.config, you need to use this .NET TCP relay binding. So normally you'd use, I think it's just called TCP binding, or net TCP binding. So the relay binding is just the one that knows how to go do it through the cloud. And then when you the current bits don't support actually hosting this natively in WAS, so you need to write a little bit of code here, and it looks more complicated than it is. You just need write a bit of code essentially to, you'll have a solution, and you can have my password here. I'm just using regular sort of clear text. You could also use card space or certificates. And essentially, this is the key line. You just need to define a unique URI, and this is actually a fixed notation. If you go through the .NET Service SDK, this stuff's really straightforward. And I called it proxy service 3. And then you just go through normal WCF stuff of essentially creating a service host and opening it. So let's see. Let me try to run that. So essentially what this is going to do is create a service on my local machine that is accessible. Well, that's not good. Oh, it looks like I lost network. All right. Well, that is actually not going to work. My network went down. It's one of the challenges with trying to demo cloud stuff. But essentially, if I were to run this, then I could go over to I'll finish it just so you can see what you would do, because there's one little trick in there that's worth seeing. So I go back to my external system, and I don't want this code anymore. But instead, what I would do now is it's literally almost the same code as I was using in the other place. So I'll actually start with that code. So what I'm going to do is I am going to define a solution name and password, and then I'm going to add a reference to. So this is one trick. You need to go to .NET Services under Program Files, Assemblies, and you have to actually import this service bus DLL. And then there are two namespaces you want to import, system.serviceModel and Microsoft.ServiceBus. And then essentially, the last trick is I need to, so I have defined this contract, right? I called it proxy contract. I need to drag that contract into my web service application, the external one that I called, and so that I can refer to it like the same contract. Oh, actually, yeah, I actually already have this. Right, so then really the only thing I need to do, so I already had the right stuff in here, is just I need to find a channel factory. So this is just the thing that news up the connection through the relay. Well, I'm actually out of time, but essentially it's about 5 more lines of code, and then I can just call this thing that's in the cloud, and it will actually relay the message to the back-end system. I'm sorry it didn't work. Didn't see the network go down while I was here. But take a look at .NET Services. It's really quite easy to use if you have a network connection. And then just to go back to my slides for 2 minutes. So, again, you also want to make sure when you're calling that Azure-based service that you add that into the web.config. But really, I guess, the key message of the demo is just the idea of, in SharePoint, use tasks, use the task pattern, both for human and system messaging. If you want to host WCF in SharePoint, do that in a separate web application. And take a look at the .NET Services stuff. It's actually fairly straightforward. Once you are familiar with WCF, getting the thing to relay through the cloud is very straightforward. That's it. Thank you very much.